I titled this, When Your In-Laws Become Outlaws. But I really thought about, how do you become a good in-law? How do you get to be a good mother-in-law, a good father-in-law? And why is there so many problems with this whole concept of in-laws and dealing with in-laws, I think part of the problem goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, where God says in His Word, He says, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother, bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh." Part of the problem is just leaving and cleaving, isn't it? Whether you're the one doing the leaving and cleaving, or whether you're the parent who's watching your child leave and cleave. On one side, you've got a child, your son, your daughter, that's transitioning into adulthood, and you're watching this take place, while at the same time, and they're going through their difficulties as they're transitioning, and then as a parent, you too are having to watch this leaving and cleaving process, and sometimes it can be very difficult. I've walked all 4 of my children through marriage. I now have 16 grandchildren. I've been counseling about 40 years. I have an earned doctorate and spent a lot of time in this particular area. But a lot of times as a parent, we have difficulty being a good in-law. We have a hard time with it, and we immediately wonder why. Why is this so difficult? And I think for a lot of people, when their children begin to grow up and they transition and they marry, I think part of the problem is that some parents are so meshed into the lives of their children. In other words, their lives their identity is so meshed into the life of their child that in many ways they kind of lose their own identity. Their identity is more around themselves as a parent, a mom, a dad, their child's academics, their child's boyfriend, girlfriend, their child's sporting or dance or whatever their child is involved in. A lot of times a parent's identity is drawn from the identity of their child. When the child grows up and marries and begins to pull away, begins to leave in order to cleave, a lot of times for a parent it's just literally hard to do. A second thing, I kind of got some notes over here. I think we have a tendency to let go because we want to control our children's life after they marry. Anytime, and let me say this, anytime you want to control a relationship, in other words, your son or your daughter gets married and you have this desire to control his or her decisions, you want to be involved in it, you're always giving your opinion, then the reality is when you're trying to control a relationship, whatever it is, you're doing it out of fear. And a lot of times a parent, when they're watching their children transition to adulthood, transitioning in a marriage, the reality is they're afraid of the decisions that they're getting ready to make, and they always want to plug in and be a part of it, and this causes problems. You have to trust your children to grow up and make good decisions. You cannot hang on to them. As the song says, you've got to let go. A third thing is, and I want to say this first. If you don't hear anything else, hear this. When your son or daughter is getting married, let's say your son is getting married, you can't look at it as I'm losing a son. If you look at it that way, that's the first problem. You've got to look at it, hey, I'm not losing a son, I'm gaining a daughter. I'm not losing a daughter, I'm gaining a son. In other words, I've got 2 girls and 2 boys. They're all grown, all married, all have children. They all have their own families. And I can honestly tell you that I have 4 sons and 4 daughters. My daughter-in-laws are just like my daughters. My son-in-laws are just like my sons. And I think how sometimes we view our children as they're growing up and as they marry, if we don't see it that way, then the in-law, the daughter-in-law, the son-in-law always feel outside the family. I want my in-laws, my son-in-laws and daughter-in-laws to see me as like a second dad to them. Now, another thing is, why do parents have difficulty? Why sometimes do we become a bad in-law? Well, the reality is sometimes it's just jealousy. You know, mom, sometimes a parent will resent the relationship. For example, a mother-in-law. I think moms kind of get the bad rap here sometimes, but moms sometimes have greater difficulty letting go. Part of that is because they feel threatened. They feel threatened. They feel like they're giving up their son, and they're not only feeling like their son he's falling in love with a woman who he had better love more than he loves his mom, and that's an adjustment for a mom. But let me tell you something, it's an adjustment for a dad. To a dad, you want to be your girl's hero. I mean, really, my daughters, I want to be their hero. I like being their hero. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a young man who's come into their life, stolen their love, in many ways their affection, and he becomes more their hero. He's the go-to man when they're in trouble or there's a difficulty. Sometimes it's hard for parents to let go of that, You have to be careful. You find yourself competing with the spouse of your child, and you don't want that. When Amy, our oldest, got married, she was the first one. And I'll never forget after the wedding, after her and Matt had left, and we were cleaning up, and that's one thing I'll never do. Cleaning up after a wedding, you're already distraught and upset. And I looked down and there was a rose, one of the roses from the wedding, and it was just crushed. It was just crushed. And in that moment I teared up and I began to cry in the church. In this lonely church as I was cleaning up. And I said, God, that's how my heart feels right now. I feel like I'm just crushed. Well, let me tell you, I love my son-in-law, Matt, and I love the 8 grandchildren they have brought into my life. You see, I wasn't losing my daughter. I was gaining an unbelievable son. And I was gaining 8 beautiful grandchildren. You see, sometimes, let me say this to young people who are watching. I'm talking to moms and dads who are trying to be good father-in-laws, good mother-in-laws. But to be a good son-in-law, to be a good daughter-in-law, keep this in mind. Don't be too hard on your father-in-law or your mother-in-law. One day you'll be wearing that hat. And let me tell you, it's hard. Let me say another thing. A lot of times when you marry into a family, you begin to recognize this family's a little bit dysfunctional. I mean, let's be honest. There can be mental illness. There can be addictive behaviors and natures. There can be some real problems. There can be alcoholism, drug addiction. There can be some kind of sexual deviant type behavior. There can be deep-seated personality issues. And a lot of times a dysfunctional family, you don't know it's dysfunctional till you begin to stress it with new people coming into that family. As new people start coming into that family and it comes under that stress, you're going to see some things that may sometimes not be too pretty. Dysfunctional families a lot of times just need counseling. They need help. Well, another thing is confrontation. A lot of times when you marry into a family or you've got a new son-in-law, daughter-in-law, sometimes as the personalities are clashing, there's a tendency to try to want to work it out. We're going to work this out. We're going to confront this and deal with it. Let me tell you, and I wrote a book called Killing the Church, and it's about confrontation. And one of the things I say in that book is nothing in this book works within a family. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? I mean, most of the time, when in-laws and families begin to have problems within a family, the last thing you need to do is confront it and deal with it. And you may think, well, that's just strange. But I can tell you this much, and I wrote it down. Let me read it. Avoid at all cost direct, volatile confrontation. In other words, shouting or even physical. Avoid at all costs direct, volatile confrontation, because when it happens, it may last a lifetime, the damage that it's done. It is just simply not worth it. So you may say, well, what do you do? What do I do? What do I do if I'm in a home or in a family that's very dysfunctional? I have some real problems, you may say, with my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, my spouse's family. They are dysfunctional. There is some addiction, some alcohol, drugs. There are some real personality bordering on even some mental illness. How do I handle that? What do I do if I can't confront it? I think first of all, you pray. You just pray, you trust the Lord, you lean on the Lord, you stay in His Word, you keep a Christ-like spirit. Secondly, when families come together, and they've got to, at times you're just going to face your in-laws. That's all there is to it. Keep those moments light. Keep them fun. Avoid conflict. You know when conflict begins to start coming up. You know when a conversation is starting to move toward, you start sensing it. You avoid that at all costs. It's just simply not worth it. So keep those moments light. Another thing, and let me stress this, quit trying to control your grown children. The reality is that it is not a compliment to your parenting skills if you've got an adult child that is still looking to you to make their decisions. Let me tell you, when you don't trust your son or daughter to make good decisions, and you feel like you've constantly got to put your opinion in, and you're constantly trying to add to the conversation, the reality is you're not only communicating that you don't trust your son or daughter, you are making their spouse angry. If you're trying to control your son's life, his decisions, you're doing it out of fear, you worry, then get ready, because he's not only going to resent you as a parent, his wife will resent you as well, because she's trying to get him to man up, to be the man that God's called him to be a good husband, to be a good father. And so, that's critical. I wrote down a couple of other things, regardless of how difficult your in-laws may be and the situation may be, don't rob your parents of an opportunity to see their child or their grandchildren. Let me tell you, don't do that. You may say, well, you don't know how difficult it is. I know how difficult it can be. But don't do that. Like I said, you pick up, you go, you visit, you control the time that you're there, you keep the conversation light, fun, you avoid controversy. If you feel controversy, you say, well, we're going to have to run, we'll see you later. But don't stop parents from seeing their grown child and their grandchildren. And you may say again, but what if my in-laws are immoral? What if they drink? What if they use foul language around my children? What if they hold to beliefs that I don't agree? Or what if they are not Christian? They hold maybe an alternate belief system. What do I do? Let me give you an example. I pastor in the inner city. Every once in a while I have an African-American man or woman come up to me. They look at me. At first they look a little sad. They say, Brother Jeff, I was raised to hate whites. And then they'll look at me and then look at me like they're about to cry, and they'll say, until I met you, until I met Sheila, until I begin to get to know white men and women and boys and girls. And hey, listen, now I realize that we're just alike. Let me tell you, in a world of racism, in a world of political views, in a world where there's a lot of opinions about abortion and LGBT and so many things, it's easy sometimes to get caught up in just simply avoiding somebody because you don't want to have to deal with that. You may say, well, let me give you an example. Your in-laws are racist. In other words, they got derogatory ways of referring to people of another color, another race. They're disrespectful, they're rude. And you're going, I don't want my children to hear that. Well, what do? You address it. And what I'm saying is, you address it by just simply saying to your child. I think that a lot of times what happens, we have to help our children process life, even their grandparents. If a grandparent uses foul language, if a grandparent has a belief that you don't hold to, using some kind of whatever it may be, when you move away from there, when you get in the car, you immediately say, let me tell you, what grandfather said, what your grandpa said a little while ago, we don't agree with that. In fact, I'm going to be, if they're real small, you can even look at them and say, I think what grandfather said or what grandma said made Jesus really sad. And when you say that, even if it's a small child, you may say, well, wait a minute, they may go back and tell my parents. They may go back and tell his parents. Hey, tough. A child can get away with confronting when you can't. A child, a little granddaughter, 3 or 4 years old, sits in her grandpa's lap and he lets out a filthy word and says something derogatory. Or he puts something on and she's there and it's an inappropriate something in the movie, and all of a sudden she looks and says, I don't think Jesus would like that word you just said. My mommy said that's not a very nice word. Let her say that. In other words, help children process. Again, I wrote down control is appropriate in the formative years. And by that I mean that if you're married into a family and your children are in a family where they're either not believers, they use foul language, they watch things that you would never allow, they do things that are going contrary to everything you believe as a Christian, then you have a responsibility in their formative years to control what they are exposed to. You control their environment. You can visit family. You can stay on the premises. You don't leave them there. And you just simply, you control their environment. Well, then the last thing I have down here, make sure you as a parent or an in-law respect your child, respect your grown child in the raising of their children. Let me say that again. As a parent, a lot of times of grown children, as they have their children, we want to give input on parenting. Now, let me tell you, it's hard enough to do that with your own child. Because again, you're controlling, and because of that, you're saying, I don't trust you to be a good parent. Let me help you and show you how to do it. And they're going, yeah, that's the last thing I want to hear. You raised me. You know, but the reality is, the truth of the matter is you have to trust your children to raise your grandchildren. You have to believe and you have to be careful, or you give so many opinions and thoughts in there before long, man, listen, they don't even want to be around you. Let me give you a little example real quick, and then I'll close with this. In raising our 4 children, Sheila breastfed all 4 of our kids. Now, you know, a lot of people nowadays, they're going back to the old natural birth, you know, breastfeeding. Breastfeeding moms are harassed more than anybody. I can remember when we were when Sheila was breastfeeding all 4 of our boys and girls, and 2 boys and 2 girls. We had our 2 girls first and then the 2 boys. And this would be the conversation. Do you think, I don't know, do you think they're getting enough? Do you think they're getting enough nourishment? And they'd be looking at Sheila, don't you think you need to supplement that? And then he'd be trying to shovel a little food in your 4-month-old, and you'll be going, no, he's getting everything he needs. He's getting everything he needs in my breast milk. He doesn't need that. He doesn't need, and besides that, you're about ready to have to do the Heimlich maneuver on your own child because they're trying to stuff something in. Trust your children to raise your grandchildren. And you may say, well, wait a minute, but I've got opinions, I've got thoughts. I think they're making some mistakes, and hey, you better be very careful in giving your opinion, because a lot of times you alienate your children away. Well, that's about all the time that we have. And if you've got any problem, if you want to communicate with me, all you do is email me at jeffparker@ssbaptistchurch.com. If you just go ssbaptistchurch.com, it'll have all our email addresses, and you can correspond with me if you got some things you need to talk about personally. Well, I love you, and take care. God bless you, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.